Today we're going to look at simplifying expressions using the order of operations. Now you've seen the order of operations before, and you may have had teachers who wrote out the word PEMDAS, P-E-M-D-A-S. I use that as well, please excuse my dear Aunt Sally, to help me remember the order. However, I'm going to write it differently. P-E, and then I'm going to stack the M and the D, and stack the A and the S. Because when I get ready to do the order of operations, the P stands for parentheses, but it can also be other grouping symbols like square brackets, so it could be parentheses, it could be square brackets, it could even be an absolute value symbol that has another component to it, but first it acts as grouping symbols. So P means to do all operations, and notice this is operations, not just a single number, do operations inside grouping symbols. And I'm going to say grouping symbols because it's not just parentheses. So inside grouping symbols. Once I've done all of those, and it may take several steps to get through to where I don't have operations left inside grouping symbols, then I'm going to do any exponents. Now, as a reminder, two things on exponents. And sorry about the writing here. First, 3 to the second power does not mean 3 times 2. It means 3 times itself, so 3 times 3, which is 9. The second thing that is vital for most scientific calculators and for any notation that you put on the paper, if you are going to take a negative number and raise it to an exponent, the negative number has to be inside parentheses, and it has to be done that way on your calculator too. So negative 2 inside parentheses to the fourth power, notice the exponents on the outside, means to take negative 2 times itself, and times itself again, and I'm going to get positive 16. If I don't put the parentheses where they need to be, I'll get the wrong answer of negative 16. Because without the parentheses, it doesn't mean negative 2 to the fourth power. It means the opposite of 2 to the fourth power. And since 2 to the fourth power is 16, the opposite of that is negative 16. So those parentheses are vital. Now, the reason I stack the M and the D is because if I don't, people think that they always have to do all multiplication before they divide. And that's not true. Multiplication and division are actually closely related. So dividing something by 2 is the same thing as multiplying it by 1/2, which means I'm going to do multiplication and division. So multiplication, I'm just going to put mult and div from left to right. So whichever one comes first, I do first. If division comes before multiplication, I divide before I multiply. Same reason we're stacking the A and the S. So addition and subtraction from left to right. So let's look at a couple of problems. The thing that draws my attention here is that there is an operation inside parentheses. It's not just the 6 inside parentheses, which would just be a number inside parentheses. There's subtraction inside those parentheses. So the very first thing I'm going to do is 6 minus 11. So I'm going to bring down the 9 and the minus 4. Now 6 minus 11 is negative 5. Since I'm raising that negative number to an exponent, I have to have the negative 5 in parentheses and then the square on the outside. At this point, I have subtraction, multiplication, and an exponent left. Well, an exponent comes before either of the other two. So I bring down the 9 and the minus 4. Negative 5 squared means negative 5 times itself, so positive 25. And I could put this as times 25, or I could put the 25 in parentheses. 4 with parentheses and 25 would mean the same thing. I have subtraction and multiplication. Multiplication comes first, so this becomes 9 minus 100. And then the very last thing I'm going to do is the 9 minus 100 for negative 91. Now, I can sort of check that answer by taking my calculator and punching in the original problem exactly the way it looks with parentheses and all, and hit equals, and it should equal negative 91. If it doesn't, I made a mistake somewhere along the way. So I will say this is negative 91. Let's say I forgot to put the parentheses, and I had this as 9 minus 4 times negative 5, and then the exponent there. Well, if I did this in my calculator then without parentheses, it would not tell me an answer of negative 91. So I would know that I made a mistake. If this equals negative 91 and the next step doesn't, I made a mistake in my first step already. So I could punch each step in, and as long as it's equal to the one before it, I know that I'm okay on that step. I just have to find the step where I made the mistake. In this case, this is 12 times negative 3/4 divided by 3 times 5. The temptation that a lot of people have is to do this multiplication and then divide. But remember, multiplication and division are whichever one comes first from left to right. So first I'm going to take 12 times negative 3/4. Well, positive times a negative is a negative. I would recommend using your calculator for this. 12 times 3 is 36, divided by 4 is 9. So this becomes negative 9 divided by 3 times 5. This division comes before the multiplication, so I divide first and get negative 3 times 5. And then last, I get negative 15 when I perform that multiplication. When I see this big fraction bar, which means division, a fraction bar is actually a grouping symbol, even though it doesn't look like it. It, in essence, puts parentheses around the numerator and parentheses around the denominator. So I simplify the numerator, simplify the denominator, and then the last thing I'm going to do in this fraction part is the division. It's okay to skip some steps when you're doing the order of operations. My rule is that you are never allowed to calculate a number and then use that same number to calculate something else in the same step. So as long as you're not doing that, you're okay. Which means if I start to think sort of backwards in this problem, the very last thing in the order of operations is addition and subtraction that are not inside grouping symbols. So the very last thing that I'm going to do in this problem is this subtraction, because it's not inside a grouping symbol. Which means that I'm going to have to simplify everything to the left of that subtraction and everything to the right of that subtraction, and then subtract. Because of that, I can start simplifying the left and the right at the same time. I also know that I have to simplify the numerator and denominator before I divide, so I'm going to start simplifying both of those at the same time. Which means I need my fraction bar. In the numerator I have subtraction and multiplication, so I'm going to multiply first. So I bring down the 10 and the minus, and then 8 times 3 is 24. In the denominator I have subtraction and an exponent. Exponents go before subtraction. 4 squared is 16, so this becomes 22 minus 16. Then bring down this subtraction. To the right of the subtraction that I'm going to do last, there's multiplication and an exponent. An exponent goes before multiplication, so this becomes 3 times. Negative 2 to the third power is negative 2 times itself and times itself again, which is negative 8. And actually, I'm going to put that in parentheses. Excuse me, I think a dot and then a negative looks kind of weird. So I still have simplifying to do here. 10 minus 24 is negative 14. 22 minus 16 is 6. Let me try to make that a better 6. Minus 3 times negative 8 is negative 24. Again, I don't like having minus and a negative just right next to each other, so I'm going to leave that negative 24 in parentheses. Now, if you take your calculator and you punch in negative 14 divided by 16, because a fraction bar means to divide, divided by 6, because a fraction bar means to divide, you get negative 2.3, and then the 3 decimal fills up the entire screen. You also have to give exact answers, so you need to convert that to a fraction instead of a decimal. On your calculator, above one key or another, you probably have something that looks like an F with arrows back and forth to a D. That means to convert a fraction to a decimal or a decimal to a fraction. If your calculator does not have that, talk to me and show me your calculator and we'll see if we can find how to do it on yours. This, instead of putting in the negative 2.3 repeating, becomes negative 2 and 1/3. It's a simplified mixed number, and then minus my negative 24. And then last but not least, if I put in my negative 2 and 1/3, and then subtract a negative 24, which is the same thing as adding a positive 24, I'm going to get an answer of 21 and 2/3. And again, if I go back to the original problem, and punch this in, I would have to put parentheses around this and then divided by this in parentheses minus 3 times, don't forget the negative 2 in parentheses, to the third power, and hit equals. I should get 21 2/3 as my answer. Now in this last problem, again, if I think about what I'm going to do last, the last things I would do in this problem are this addition, and then the very last thing, this subtraction, because they are not inside parentheses, which means I can simplify here, here, and here at the same time if I need to. Well, 6 can't be simplified, so it's just going to come down. But 2 to the 4th power is positive 16. Bring down my minus. And then 2 times in brackets, which are grouping symbols. I've got division and multiplication. Since the division comes first, I'm going to divide first. 4 divided by 2 is 2. And then bring down my times 3. Bring down my square bracket, and then my exponent. So the 6 plus 16 I'm going to leave alone for now. Minus 2. I'm not done with what's inside the square brackets. I still have an operation in there. So 2 times 3 is 6. Next, bring down my 6 plus 16 because I'm not going to use that for a while. I have multiplication and an exponent. An exponent goes first. So minus 2 times 36. Addition, subtraction, and multiplication. I multiply first. So 6 plus 16 minus 72. Now I've got addition and subtraction. I do whichever one of those comes first. So 6 plus 16 is 22. Bring down my minus 72. And lastly, 22 minus 72 is negative 50. Again, if I punch the original problem into my calculator exactly the way it looks and hit equals, I should get negative 50 as an answer. Thank you.